The Promise of the West. The year was 1846. The United States was catching a fever. It wasn't a sickness of the body, but of the mind. It was called manifest destiny, the belief that God intended for Americans to spread their nation from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific Ocean. In the crowded, smoky streets of the East Coast cities, rumors flew like sparks. They said California was a paradise. They said the winter there never touched the ground, that the soil was so rich you could plant a stick and watch it grow into a tree, and that land, thousands of acres of it, was free for the taking. For families struggling with debt, cold winters, and cramped lives, this sounded like salvation. In Springfield, Illinois, two wealthy brothers caught the fever. George and Jacob Donner were not desperate men. They were successful farmers, well-respected and comfortable. George was 62 years old, an age when most men in the 19th century were preparing for a quiet retirement. But George Donner had a restless spirit. He looked at his wife, Tamsin, and his children, and he decided that comfortable wasn't enough. He wanted a legacy. He wanted California. Together with their neighbor, James Reed, a fiery, intelligent, and somewhat arrogant businessman, they began to plan the greatest adventure of their lives. They sold their farms, they sold their furniture, they took that money and built custom wagons that were the envy of the town. These weren't just wagons, they were prairie schooners, massive wooden ships designed to sail across the ocean of grass that was the American Midwest. George Donner's wagon was so large it had built-in storage compartments and a stove. Tamsin Donner, a small but fiercely intelligent woman who worked as a teacher, packed books, school supplies, and fine clothes. They believed they were going on a grand tour, a long but manageable journey to a better life. They had no idea that they were packing their own coffins. In April 1846, the party set out from Springfield. The mood was jubilant. The spring air was fresh, the grass was green, and the road ahead seemed clear. They joined a massive river of humanity flowing west toward Independence, Missouri, the jumping-off point for the Oregon and California trails. At Independence, the chaos was palpable. Thousands of wagons, tens of thousands of oxen, and shouting men filled the dusty streets. It was here that the first cracks in their plan began to show. The timing was everything. To cross the continent, you had to leave early enough to get over the massive Sierra Nevada mountains in California before the first snows fell of winter. If you were late, the mountains became a wall of ice that no man could pass. The Donner and Reed families were slightly behind schedule, but they weren't worried. They were well equipped. They had strong oxen, and they had a secret weapon, or so they thought. James Reed had been reading a book. It was a guide titled The Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, written by a man named Lansford Hastings. In this book, Hastings claimed he had discovered a new route. He called it the Hastings Cut. He promised that this new path, which went south of the Great Salt Lake, would shave nearly 300 miles off the journey. 300 miles meant weeks of travel saved. It meant beating the winter easily. There was just one problem. Lansford Hastings had never actually traveled the full route himself when he wrote the book. It was a theory, a guess, a line drawn on a map by a man looking for fame. As the wagon train moved west across the Great Plains, the journey was beautiful but hard. They saw massive herds of buffalo that darkened the horizon. They crossed rushing rivers where wagons had to be floated like boats. Children played in the tall grass, and at night the families gathered around campfires, singing songs and dreaming of the California sun. But the clock was ticking. By the time they reached Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming, they were dragging. The oxen were getting tired. The heavily loaded wagons of the Donner and Reed families were slow. It was at Fort Bridger, a small trading post in the mountains, that the moment of fate arrived. This was the decision point. To the right lay the established trail, long, winding, but safe and known. To the left lay the Hastings Cut. The safe route was crowded. It was dusted out. It would take longer. The cutoff was seductive. Hastings himself had left word at the fort that he was guiding a group ahead and that the road was passable. James Reed was determined. He was a man who liked efficiency, a man who believed in shortcuts. He argued passionately that they should take the cutoff. Why walk hundreds of miles extra when a straight line exists, he argued. The other men were hesitant, but he was persuasive. He was a leader. A warning came from an old mountain man, a friend of Reed's, named James Clyman, who had just ridden the route on horseback. Clyman looked Reed in the eye and said, "Take the old road. This new way, it's not a road. It's jagged rocks and salt deserts. You can't pull wagons through there. You'll die." Reed didn't listen. He saw the logic of the map, not the reality of the terrain. He convinced the group, 87 people in total, including many small children, to turn left. On July 31st, 1846, the Donner Party turned their wagons away from the known world and entered the Hastings Cut. As the wheels crunched onto the rocky soil of the new path, the sky was blue and the sun was warm. They didn't know it, but the door to the trap had just clicked shut. The shortcut to hell. The Hastings Cut was a lie. It wasn't a road, it was a wilderness of steep canyons, choking sagebrush, and jagged boulders. Within days of turning onto the new route, the Donner Party realized something was terribly wrong. The trail didn't exist. The wagon wheels weren't rolling over packed dirt, they were smashing into rocks. The men, including 62-year-old George Donner, had to walk ahead of the wagons with axes and shovels. They weren't traveling anymore. They were road building. They had to chop down trees and move massive stones just to advance 1 mile. The physical toll was immediate. Hands blistered, tempers flared, and the oxen began to lose weight. But the psychological toll was worse. They knew in the back of their minds that every hour spent hacking through the brush was an hour of summer sunlight wasted. Then came the Great Salt Lake Desert. Lansford Hastings, the author of the guide, had stated that this desert was a dry drive of about 40 miles. He claimed it would take 2 days to cross. Based on this, the families filled their water barrels and cut grass for the animals, expecting a difficult but manageable 48 hours.
They rolled out onto the salt flats. At first, the surface was hard and white, crunching under the wheels like frozen snow. But as they ventured deeper, the crust began to break. Beneath the thin layer of salt lay a deep, sticky gray mud. The heavy wagons, laden with heirlooms and furniture, began to sink. The wheels bogged down to the hubs. The oxen, thirsty and panicked, strained against their yokes, their hooves sinking into the mire. The sun beat down on the white salt, reflecting upward, cooking the travelers from both above and below. 40 miles came and went. There was no end in sight. The water ran out on the 3rd day. Panic set in. The 40-mile drive turned out to be 80 miles across a waterless wasteland. The mirages began to torment them. They saw lakes and rivers that weren't there. Fathers watched their children's lips crack and bleed from dehydration. In a desperate bid to survive, James Reed unhooked his oxen from his wagons to let them run toward water, hoping to gather them later. But the smell of water miles away drove the animals mad. They vanished into the night, never to be seen again. When the group finally stumbled out of the desert and reached a spring on the other side, they were a broken people. The crossing had taken 6 days, not 2. They had lost 36 oxen. Several wagons had to be abandoned in the desert, left like skeletons on the salt. The Reed family, once the wealthiest and best equipped, was now destitute. They had to spread their children and belongings among the other families. The shortcut had cost them weeks of precious time. It was now late September. The air was growing crisp. The leaves on the aspen trees were turning gold. To a casual observer, it was beautiful. To the Donner Party, it was a death sentence. Tensions within the group reached a boiling point. They were tired, scared, and looking for someone to blame. Naturally, eyes turned to James Reed. He was the one who had pushed for the shortcut. He was the one who had insisted they turn left. On October 5th, the stress exploded into violence. The wagon train was struggling up a steep, sandy hill. A young, popular teamster named John Snyder was whipping his oxen in frustration. James Reed told him to stop, fearing the animals would die. Snyder, exhausted and furious, snapped. He raised his heavy whip handle and struck Reed over the head, splitting his scalp open. As Snyder raised the whip to strike again, Reed's wife rushed in to stop him. The whip came down, hitting her. Blinded by blood and rage, James Reed pulled a hunting knife and drove it into Snyder's chest. Snyder stumbled back and died within minutes. The camp was in an uproar. Snyder was beloved. Reed was resented. The travelers wanted to hang James Reed right there on the spot. They raised a wagon tongue to serve as a gallows, but Reed's wife begged for his life. After a tense standoff, a compromise was reached. James Reed was banished. He was forced to leave the wagon train, leaving his wife and children behind with the group. He had to ride ahead, alone, into the wilderness, without a weapon. It was essentially an execution by exile. Now, the group had lost its most capable leader. They were leaderless, demoralized, and dangerously late. By the time the Donner Party finally rejoined the main California trail, it was late October. They had wasted nearly a month on the shortcut. Other wagon trains that had taken the long, safe route were already safely in California, enjoying the warm valleys. The Donner Party was still high in the mountains of Nevada. They pushed forward, desperate to beat the weather. They could see the Sierra Nevada range ahead of them, jagged, gray peaks rising like a wall against the sky. The pass they needed to cross was 7,000 feet up. On October 31st, the forward section of the party reached the foot of the pass. They looked up. The peaks were clear. If they pushed hard, they could make it over in 2 or 3 days. But the wagons were broken. The oxen were skeletons. The people were exhausted. They decided to rest for just a day or two in a meadow to gather strength for the final climb. That night, the clouds moved in. It started as a light rain, tapping gently on the canvas covers of the wagons. Then the temperature dropped. The rain turned to sleet, and then the sleet turned to snow. Soft, white flakes began to fall. At first it looked peaceful, but it didn't stop. It fell for an hour, then 2, then all night. When the sun rose on the morning of November 4th, the pass was gone. The road was buried under 5 feet of fresh powder snow. They hitched up the oxen and tried to push through, but the animals floundered in the drifts, buried up to their chests. The wagons were like anchors. They couldn't move. Panic turned to terror. They were trapped. They retreated to a small lake near the summit, now known as Donner Lake. They realized they weren't going anywhere. They frantically began to build cabins. They didn't have proper tools or logs, so they used the roofs of the wagons and brush to create crude, dark, smoky shelters. 81 people were now trapped on the wrong side of the mountain. The snow kept falling. It fell until the cabins were buried completely, leaving only chimneys poking out of the white landscape. Inside those dark, freezing holes, the food began to run out. First they ate the remaining cattle. Then they ate the boiled hides of the cattle. Then they caught mice. Then they boiled the leather from their shoes. And then there was nothing left to eat at all. The forlorn hope. By mid-December 1846, the snow at Donner Lake was not just deep, it was a geological layer. It was 12 feet high, burying the cabins so completely that the families lived in subterranean darkness. They had to dig tunnels just to get to the surface to look for wood. Inside the cabins, the air was foul, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, sickness, and boiling leather. The ox hides they were eating, strips of gluey hair-covered skin, provided almost no nutrition. The children were growing lethargic. Their stomachs were distended. The mothers were drawing up, unable to nurse the babies. Desperation birthed a plan. It was a suicide mission, but staying was a death sentence. On December 16, 1846, 17 people decided to try and walk out. They fashioned crude snowshoes from the wooden frames of oxbows and strips of rawhide. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. The group included fathers, mothers, and even young boys. Among them was William Eddy, a man of immense physical strength who left his wife and children behind, promising to bring back help. There was also Patrick Dolan, a bachelor, and Franklin Graves, an older man who had designed the snowshoes.
They took 6 days of starvation rations, a few ounces of dried beef, and a little flour. They said their goodbyes. It was a scene of utter heartbreak. Husbands kissed wives, not knowing if they would ever see them again. Mothers looked at their starving children one last time before climbing up the white wall of the pass. 2 turned back almost immediately. 15 kept going. The climb was grueling. The snow was soft, and even with the snowshoes, they sank. Their legs burned, the cold air seared their lungs. But driven by adrenaline, they made it over the pass. They saw the western horizon. They thought the worst was over. They were wrong. As they descended the western slope, the sun disappeared. A massive storm slammed into the Sierra Nevada. It was a blizzard of biblical proportions. The wind screamed, blinding them. They lost the trail. For days they wandered in circles. The 6 days of rations ran out. On Christmas Day, 1846, the Forlorn Hope was trapped in what they would later call the Camp of Death. They were huddled in a pit dug into the snow, shivering under a single blanket as the storm raged above. They had not eaten in 4 days. The fire went out. Paralyzed by the cold, insanity began to set in. Patrick Dolan, the bachelor, began to hallucinate. He stripped off his clothes, screaming that he was too hot, and ran into the blizzard. William Eddy chased him down and dragged him back, but the damage was done. Dolan fell into a coma. Within hours, he was dead. Others followed. Franklin Graves died in the arms of his daughters. Now the survivors faced the ultimate question, the question that has haunted this story for nearly 200 years. They were starving. They were freezing, and lying next to them in the snow were the bodies of their friends. Someone spoke the words that no one wanted to hear. If they wanted to live, if they wanted to save the children they had left behind at the lake, they had to eat. They averted their eyes. They wept. But survival is a vicious instinct. Using a hidden knife, they cut the flesh from the arms and legs of the dead. They roasted it over a small fire they had managed to relight. They labeled the meat so that no one would have to eat their own relative. It was a ritual of horror, performed with a grim, mechanical necessity. Fueled by this grisly sustenance, the survivors stood up. They were stronger now. The taboo had been broken. They took pieces of the meat, dried them for the journey, and kept walking. But the ordeal wasn't over. The group began to hunt, not for animals, but for each other.
Two Native American guides, Luis and Salvador, who had joined the Donner Party earlier to help, realized that the starving white men were looking at them with predatory eyes. Terrified, the two men fled into the woods. Days later, William Eddy found them lying in the snow, exhausted and near death. In a final act of brutality, another member of the group, William Foster, shot both Luis and Salvador. They were eaten too. For 33 days, the forlorn hope staggered through the mountains. They were skeletons wrapped in rags, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Finally, on January 17, 1847, a figure stumbled out of the foothills and into a Native American village in the Sacramento Valley. It was William Eddy. He was barely human. The Native Americans, members of the Miwok tribe, were horrified by his appearance. They rushed to help him, carrying him and feeding him acorn bread. Of the 15 who set out, only 7 survived. 8 were dead. 7 of the dead had been consumed. But they had done the impossible. They had breached the wall of snow. News of the survivors reached Sutter Fort, the main American outpost in California. The people there were shocked. They had assumed the Donner Party was dead months ago. The alarm was raised. People are starving in the mountains. James Reed, the man who had been banished for murder months earlier, was there. He had made it to California safely and had been frantically trying to organize a rescue mission all winter, but the snow had been too deep. Now, hearing that his wife and children might still be alive, he threw everything he had into the effort. Rescue parties were formed. Men packed backpacks with dried beef and flour. They prepared to hike back up into the frozen hell. But what they would find at Donner Lake was far worse than what the forlorn hope had described. At the lake, the snow was now 20 feet deep. The cattle were long gone. The leather was gone. The mice were gone. Inside the dark, buried cabins, the people were slowly going mad. Some families had shut themselves off, hoarding what little they had. Others were dead, their bodies stacked in the corners like firewood because the survivors were too weak to drag them up through the snow to bury them. In the Murphy cabin, Milt Elliott died. He had been a faithful driver for the Reed family. As his body lay there, the survivors looked at him. They looked at their starving children. The knives came out again. When the first rescue party finally crested the pass in February 1847, they looked down at the lake. It was a white, silent graveyard. They saw no smoke. They heard no sound. They yelled, "Hello?" From a hole in the snow, a woman emerged. She looked like a ghost. Her skin pulled tight over her skull, her eyes wild. She stared at the rescuers in disbelief. "Are you men from California, or are you angels from heaven?" The rescuers arrived, but they couldn't take everyone. They could only take those strong enough to walk. They had to make a choice: who lives and who is left behind to wait. The starved camp, February 1847. The silence of Donner Lake was broken by the shouts of the first relief party, but the joy was short-lived. The rescuers, carrying heavy packs of food, looked at the survivors and realized the math didn't work. There were too many people and not enough supplies. They had to make a heart-wrenching decision. They could only guide the strongest, those who could walk on their own, or children small enough to be carried. The scene was an absolute agony. Mothers who were too weak to walk had to hand their small children to strangers, watching them disappear into the white trees, wondering if they would ever see them again. Tamsin Donner, the small, tough schoolteacher, faced an impossible choice. She was strong enough to leave. Her children were leaving, but her husband, James Donner, the leader of the expedition, was dying. An infection in his hand had turned into gangrene. He couldn't move. Tamsin looked at her children, then at her husband, she chose loyalty. She kissed her children goodbye, sent them with the rescuers, and turned back into the dark, freezing cabin to die with her husband. The first relief marched away with 23 survivors. It was a death march. The snow was soft, and the children struggled. One by one, people began to falter. But on the trail, they saw a figure approaching from the west. It was James Reed.
The man who had been banished for murder, the exile, had returned. He was leading the second relief party. In the middle of the frozen wilderness, he reunited with his wife and 2 of his children. The family that had been torn apart by violence and snow was coming back together. But Reed couldn't stop to celebrate. 2 of his children were still trapped at the lake. Reed gave his wife some food and pushed on toward the cabins. When James Reed arrived at the lake, he saw the full extent of the horror. The snow had melted slightly around the cabin doors, revealing hair, bones, and half-eaten limbs scattered on the ground. The social order had completely collapsed. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about madness. Reed quickly gathered a large group, 31 people, and began the trek out. This was the second relief. But the Sierra Nevada was not done with them. As they crossed the high pass, the sky turned black. The wind began to howl with the sound of a freight train. A massive blizzard, as bad as the first one, slammed into the mountain. They were trapped in the open. They couldn't move forward. They couldn't move back. They dug a massive pit in the snow to get out of the wind. They started a fire at the bottom. But the heat of the fire melted the snow beneath it, and the fire sank deeper and deeper, eventually hitting the wet ground and sizzling out. For 2 days and 2 nights the storm raged. The wind chill was far below zero. In that pit, known to history as the Starved Camp, hell broke loose. 5-year-old Isaac Donner died. As soon as the breath left his body, the starving survivors looked at him not as a child, but as food. In the screaming wind, with James Reed trying desperately to maintain order, the survivors began to eat the dead. A mother, Elizabeth Graves, lay dying. She called her crying children to her side. She told them to use her body to survive. She pleaded with them to live. When she died, her children sat on her body to keep it warm, crying until hunger took over. When the storm finally cleared, James Reed was half dead. He had to leave the weakest behind in the Starved Camp and make a desperate dash for help. Days later, the third relief party arrived at the Starved Camp. What they found traumatized them for the rest of their lives. They looked into the pit and saw children sitting on a log, smeared with blood, eating the internal organs of their own parents. The survivors were like feral animals. They didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay near the food. The rescuers had to physically drag the children away from the bodies. Back at the lake, things were even quieter. Most people were dead. The only ones left were those too weak to move, and one man who was surprisingly strong, Louis Kessberg. Kessberg was a German immigrant, a tall, blue-eyed man who had been accused of wife-beating earlier on the trail. Now, in the isolation of the cabins, he had turned into something monstrous. Tamsin Donner, who had stayed behind with her husband, was still alive. She was healthy, relatively speaking. She had kept herself strong, hoping to walk out. When the third relief left, Tamsin was still there. George Donner was barely clinging to life. Tamsin told the rescuers she would not leave him until he took his last breath. Weeks passed. The snow began to melt. The spring sun finally touched the mountains. In April 1947, a final group, the fourth relief, went up the mountain. Their goal wasn't really rescue. They assumed everyone was dead. They were going to salvage property and recover goods. They arrived at the cabins. The silence was absolute. No smoke, no voices. They found George Donner's body. He had been carefully wrapped in a sheet and laid out. He had died peacefully. But Tamsin was gone. Then the rescuers saw smoke rising from one distinct cabin, the Murphy cabin. They approached it, guns drawn. The door creaked open. A creature stepped out. It was a man, but he looked like a beast. His hair was long and matted. His beard was filthy. He was surrounded by buckets of blood and layers of human bones. It was Louis Kessberg. He was the last man standing. The rescuers looked around. They saw a pot on the fire. Inside was human flesh. They saw fresh bones. They asked him, "Where's Tamsin Donner?" Kessberg looked at them. He was calm, too calm. He told them that Tamsin had arrived at his cabin late one night, freezing and delirious, after George had died. He claimed he tried to help her, but she died that night. But the rescuer saw something that made their blood run cold. They found Tamsin's paintings. They found her silver spoons. And in the pot, they found evidence that Kessberg had not just eaten Tamsin to survive. There was a dead ox leg freezing in the snow outside the cabin, meat that Kessberg hadn't touched. He had chosen to eat Tamsin Donner instead of the animal meat. The rescuers realized the horrifying truth. Kessberg hadn't eaten because he was starving. He had eaten because he had grown to like it.
The Long Shadow, April 1847. The high Sierra was blindingly bright. Inside the dark, foul-smelling cabin, the rescuers of the 4th Relief Party had a rope around Louis Kessberg's neck. They accused him of murdering Tamsin Donner for her money and her flesh. They found George Donner's gold coins hidden in Kessberg's waistband. They threatened to hang him right there on the spot. Kessberg, weak and trembling, begged for his life. He claimed Tamsin had died of the cold, and he had only taken the money to return it to her children. He admitted to eating her body, but he swore he did not kill her. The rescuers didn't believe him, but they couldn't bring themselves to execute a man who looked more like a corpse than a human being. They dragged him out of the cabin. It was the final departure. Before they left, the rescuers looked around the camp one last time. It was a scene from hell. Skulls, hair, and bones were scattered everywhere. The snow, now melting rapidly, revealed the full scale of the tragedy. They couldn't bury everyone. The ground was still too frozen. So they turned their backs on the horror and began the descent. When Kessberg hobbled into Sutter's Fort weeks later, he was not greeted as a survivor. He was greeted as a monster. The story of his survival and his alleged taste for human flesh had spread across California. People refused to shake his hand. Children ran from him in the street. For the rest of his life, Louis Kessberg lived under a dark cloud, vehemently denying that he had murdered Tamsin Donner, though few believed him. He died decades later, poor and alone, the last ghost of the Donner Party. The statistics of the tragedy were grim. Of 87 people who had entered the Hastings Cut, only 48 survived. Nearly half the party had died. 2 entire families, the Murphys and the Donners, were almost completely wiped out. Most of the survivors were children. But amidst the horror, there were miracles. The Reed family, James Reed, his wife Margaret, and their 4 children had all survived. They were the only family to come through the ordeal without losing a single member. James Reed, the man banished for murder, the man who had been kicked out of the wagon train to die, had ended up being the savior who led the rescue efforts. He eventually became a successful real estate developer in San Jose, California. A street in San Jose is still named after him today. The site of the tragedy, the cabins at the lake, became a place of infamy, A few months after the rescue, a detachment of the U.S. Army under General Stephen Kearny passed through the area. They were so horrified by the sight of the unburied skeletons and the half-eaten remains that they gathered everything into the cabins and burned them to the ground. They wanted to erase the physical evidence of the nightmare. But the memory could not be erased. The Hastings Cut was abandoned. No wagon train ever used it again. The dream of a shortcut had become a cautionary tale written in blood. Today, if you drive on Interstate 80 through the Sierra Nevada mountains, you pass directly over the site. It is one of the busiest highways in America. You drive past a beautiful, shimmering alpine lake. It is no longer called Truckee Lake. It is called Donner Lake. There is a monument there now. It is a massive stone pedestal topped with a statue of a pioneer family facing west. The pedestal is exactly 22 feet tall. That height is not random. 22 feet marks the depth of the snow that winter. When you stand at the base and look up at the statue, you realize that the survivors lived, slept, and died, buried under that much snow. The story of the Donner Party is more than just a gruesome tale of cannibalism. It is the dark inverse of the American dream. It is a story about hubris, about bad leadership, and about the terrifying indifference of nature. But it is also a story about the unbreakable will to survive. It reminds us that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we think, and that sometimes the only way to cross the mountain is to leave a part of your humanity behind.